Hello and welcome to The World is Our Cloister, the monthly podcast from the Irish Dominican Friars, where we let you glimpse our life in the Dominican cloister and also take a look at the world through a Dominican lens. Very excited about today's episode because I'm constantly excited about the subject of today's episode, which is St Thomas Aquinas. But many of you are wondering, I know, what is the big deal about him? To help me answer that question, I have with me Father Conor McDonough.
Hello.
Just kind of waiting for Father Conor to
say
hello.
I'm here.
As soon as I mentioned Thomas Aquinas, he just went off into a reverie, just ecstasy,
dreaming.
you know.
Absolutely.
We also have Father Alan O'Sullivan. Say hello, Father.
Hello.
It's great to have you both. Thank you, brothers, for being here on the pod.
And your father, Chris, now, is this the first episode you're recording as a priest?
It is.
Wow.
Yeah, thanks be to God.
Congratulations.
And thanks for calling that out, Father Conor, so
yes.
we could just celebrate that for a moment.
Yes, absolutely.
But I'm far too humble for all the attention to be on me, so we could talk about me for another little minute if you want. Or
Feel free.
Okay, you don't seem that enthusiastic. I think we'll probably just move on to the real subject. Who was also a Dominican priest,
yes.
Our brother St Thomas Aquinas. What is the big deal? St Thomas Aquinas is just like a totally dehumanized brain. He's just like a brain in a vat. He was really clever but had no personality.
Correct.
Okay, podcast over. That's a wrap. That's great. Let's break for coffee.
No, that is false. That is
absolutely false.
Yeah.
Absolutely false. And we want to be here as Dominicans to be able to call out the falsehoods about St. Thomas, defend him, not only because he is our brother, but because he is also the founder of the Dominican order.
False.
Also false. So
people do sometimes think that. He's like the main person.
Think.
You're Dominican, Thomas Aquinas, instead of you're Dominican, Dominic. It's so funny. Yeah.
The Dominican order.
Yes.
Even though it's like an unofficial name for the order, because officially we're the order of preachers, yes. People just automatically assume because St. Thomas Aquinas is the most famous Dominican. But that's kind of what, it's not an episode about St. Dominic, but that's kind of what St. Dominic wanted. It's kind of what he had in mind. He didn't really know St. Thomas Aquinas, but he definitely didn't want to be the front and center of attention. Neither did St. Thomas, in fairness, right?
Absolutely.
No.
Father Alan, do you have any favourite stories about St. Thomas from his life that you would like to share? What kind of grasps you about St. Thomas?
Well, one of the stories I remember, one of his inaugural lectures in Paris, and maybe his master's, was it, Conor? Yeah. And he's guarded by 300 archers. Okay, so just think about it. Okay, so a young Dominican friar, a theologian, is giving his first lecture, his debut, and there are 300 archers prepared for an attack. Okay, so it'll give you a sense of the tension of the time, yes, and how much theology, counted at that time, and how important, and maybe part of the revolution that he was part of, the Aristotelianism and whatever is behind that, because the Dominicans had arrived, they'd taken chairs in universities, and they weren't liked by the secular masters, and that was the debate at the time. Today it might be identity politics or something like that, or it could be what's happening in Israel, but it's but at that time it was theology and who was teaching and who needed to be protected, who would get a platform. Like, it was no platform or stuff.
St. Thomas was the original cancelled. He was like,
it's cancel culture.
He was continuously cancelled, but with archers.
Exactly.
Except that the archers were defending him. That's absolutely amazing. A whole legion of archers.
Another example of that is one of his sermons was interrupted by a guy who was responsible for maintaining discipline among university students. He actually broke discipline, started roaring and shouting at Thomas Aquinas in the Cathedral of Notre Dame.
Oh my goodness!
During one of his sermons on related issues, and I just think they're really good examples, because we can imagine that everything was peaceful and perfect in the time of St. Thomas. Everybody just thought he was the bee's knees and the cat's pajamas, but actually, he was a human being in a human context, a real human context, when there were all kinds of different tensions, and he was doing something quite new. We think of him as just like the kind of totally settled character, and as if the Thomistic way is just kind of was obvious at the time. But he was doing something quite new in the 13th century.
We tend to think of him as like a dusty old academic who just is for the status quo.
Yeah.
But funny you mentioned there that he's actually quite groundbreaking.
Yes.
Conor, like he was bringing in elements that were controversial, causing people to shout at him in cathedrals. Yeah. What kind of elements were they?
Well, I mean, there's a lot about him that was new. I mean, the Dominican order itself was a new thing. Yeah. So it's worth remembering that a lot of people will know the story of, when Thomas joined the Dominicans, that his family actually kidnapped him and held him prisoner because they wanted him to be a Benedictine monk, not a Dominican friar. The Dominicans were new. They were kind of almost an unknown quantity. Universities were fairly new at the time as well.
That's true.
They had just begun to form in the late 12th century in Paris and Bologna and elsewhere. And another new element is Aristotle, the philosophy of Aristotle.
Yeah.
So you have these new works being rediscovered, coming in from the Arab world, as kind of the Arab world is kind of reconquered by Christian armies in Spain especially. You have these new texts being rediscovered from Aristotle, and he provides a method for doing science of any kind, which could apply to history or botany or theology. And Thomas is one of the early adopters of that new method in theology, in a university, in a new order. So he's anything but dusty.
And that upset an awful lot of people,
yeah,
including his family. So you mentioned that his family were super upset about him joining the Dominican order, this ragtag band of preaching friars. Who are these guys? They look like monks. They're not in monasteries. They're wandering around the place. They haven't even shoes on their feet. We don't want this for our son. So what is like some of the background of St. Thomas? Why were his family so upset about him joining the Dominicans?
I think because they're noble and because they've got prestige. They have their settlement, they have their household, they have their expectations for their sons. You become abbot of Montecassino, you become a Benedictine, and I suppose it's like even, Pope Benedict talked about sometimes the church gets so powerful that we have to take the stuff from her, we have to take the monasteries, or, take their prestige from them. So that was taken from Thomas in a sense by the Lord, in the sense that the Lord called him to this new itinerant band of preachers.
Yeah.
And he wasn't like an up mover, he was a down mover. He was downwardly mobile in his time, and that was upsetting for the status quo. And and I suppose even what Father Conor was saying, that his teaching was even upsetting, for the status quo. So you can understand why they have expectations. They're noble. They want to, they want to win the All Ireland like we want to do today. We want to do things. We want to be seen out there, and he just breaks down all those expectations.
I'm getting the notion in my mind that like what I might call this episode is St Thomas Aquinas, not a people pleaser. St Thomas Aquinas, absolute rebel from the get-go, like upsetting the apple cart. He clearly has his own personal conviction, right? He's not just going along, he's not acquiescing to the wishes of his family. Oh yes, okay, mother, I will go and be a very powerful abbot and bring prestige to you and father, even though we are nobles and we have this. No, I'm going to join this band of preachers because I think that's where the Lord wants me to be. That's where I will bring the most help and like my own talents and abilities.
Exactly.
He was a man of incredible talent. One of my favorite stories about St. Thomas is how his brothers did kidnap him once he joined the Dominicans, and they found out he was going to travel from, I think, Naples to Paris to begin his studies. And they said, okay, well, if he's not going to do what we say, we will kidnap him, put him in a tower, as you do. And they locked him there for like a whole year. And it's reported that he like memorized at least large chunks of scripture. He just put the time to use and used his prodigious memory to just put away all these texts that he could then quote from in his works. And
there's a lovely one of his biographers says during that time of imprisonment he was hemmed in his body, but he was free to roam in his mind, and his mind expanded in scripture, in the works of Aristotle as well, and a theologian called Peter Lombard. And it's a beautiful moment, and I think it shows you're putting your finger on something which is an aspect of holiness which we don't often emphasize, kind of a holy stubbornness or a holy tenacity in service of the truth. So he's not fickle. He knows this is what he's called to, and he just stubbornly and placidly just proceeds. And it's the same way that he does his theology for the rest of his life. He's serving the truth. It's not necessarily with great intellectual fireworks or brilliant images, but he just stubbornly and tenaciously pursues the truth by the methods that he regards as best.
Yeah, it's theology that he is known for. Probably the most. He's not actually known for like the aspects of his personality and what have you, but it is how he draws people in. Yeah. So I was a diocesan seminarian, and the little bit of St Thomas Aquinas that we did read really appealed to me. Yeah. Okay, so he can't pour, I suppose, all his passionate kind of emotions and so on into his theology. That's just not done. Yeah. It's far more useful to be clear cut, concise, clear. That's actually what appealed to me about his theology. I'm not sure about you brothers, about how when you read St Thomas, what are the things that really stand out for you, and how do you feel this is like useful? And how are so many people devoted to this man's writing?
Yeah, I think at the same time, okay, a lot of his personality doesn't come through in his writings, and that's the style or the method he has. But at the same time, like, he's a great observer of human nature. Like when he talks about mocking people and derision, the sin of derision, he talks about the wrinkling of the nose.
That's right.
Brilliant.
But it's, is that what we do when we deride people, when we mock them? He says, yeah, we do. We wrinkle our nose, Yeah. And he has that sense. And even another little part of that, he says that sometimes we can poke fun at people, but it's only a kind of a small little, a slight rebuke, which we say, oh, you're from Galway or you're from Roscommon.
Careful now, careful.
Yeah. But he understands that...
He didn't mention Belfast, he knows better than that.
That there's a right way of jesting with people. There's a line. He understands that. And if you go beyond that, you become too cruel or you go too far. He understands that as well. But the wrinkling of the nose was a great image, I thought.
He's not in an ivory tower, you see. Yeah. He's actually, he's living his life in community with his brothers. And as Father Allen says, he is well versed in human nature and what people are like.
Yeah,
ultimately, he's realistic, isn't he?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's spot on, that we can sometimes imagine him to be really robotic, just because your first impression of him when you read these things, it can read like something, that Dr. Spock might produce or something like that. Initially, it doesn't read like something very spiritually enriching, but if you get beyond that, you find in him not only an expert in divinity, but as Father Allen said, an expert in humanity. And for me, it was, when I was a teenager, actually, I'd real doubts about my faith, and I was kind of not really going to my parents with these questions anymore. You're a teenager. I went to some of my teachers, and they had, they didn't really engage with my questions all that much. And I kind of thought, gosh, is there anything really substantial in this faith, or should I just leave it behind along with everything else in childhood? And it was the early days of the internet. There was actually a website which is still up there. You can get the whole summa of St Thomas Aquinas online on newadvent.org. So with a really slow internet connection, I actually started looking at it and reading some of these things. And I understood about 5% of what I was reading, but I realized, my gosh, there is something rich and rigorous here. There's a real serious intellectual tradition. There's something to be investigated here. Yeah. It's not just childish assertions that reason and faith are friends. I think that's the first time I really felt totally convicted that reason and faith are friends. Is when I started reading Thomas for the first time, even though I understood very little. And from then on, he's been a constant companion for me.
I can't believe that New Advent goes back.
What is back that, to the 1940s when I was... This is
a cheap shot.
Early 2000s.
Father Allen, is that okay? Was that enough derision?
That crossed the line.
As far as it's crossed the line. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Your nose is wrinkled.
Your nose is wrinkled.
My nose is always wrinkled. Yeah. I was thinking of something when you were speaking, Father Conor, about something Bishop Barron used to say. Another huge fan of St Thomas Aquinas. He, I think, had a similar experience, but it was one of his teachers actually in school who introduced him to the 5 ways of St Thomas, when he was really mulling through the faith and does God exist and so on. So he read the 5 ways. I think it was how he was introduced to them. How it's done is so important, because I think if you just open up the Summa, it's not going to knock your socks off. Yeah, straight off. You know, it seemed, maybe it did for you, but
not quite.
But not quite. Yeah, the way it's kind of introduced to you is super important. So it was something that Bishop Barron, he actually quoted as well from G.K. Chesterton, I think, is the line, and it's, how come the angels can fly? They take themselves so lightly.
Yeah.
And we know St Thomas as like the angelic doctor.
Yeah.
And there are a number of different ways, a number of different reasons, I suppose, as to why St Thomas could be known that way. He was quite angelic in his nature. He talked an awful lot about the angels, but he doesn't take himself all that seriously. You know, because when you're talking about like intellectual heft that this man has, and yet he remains like a truly, truly humble man. One very famous story from St Thomas's life, and it's right towards the end, is he had celebrated Mass on the feast of St Nicholas. He experienced something in that Mass. He paused. I think he might have levitated. I'm not sure about that. Like, I can't remember what his biographers like Torel and so on say, but it was reported anyway that he was transfixed for quite a period of time. Yeah. He finished his Mass, and then of course he went back to his cell, and his secretary Reginald brought him his papers, and he said, I'm not writing anymore because everything I have written seems as so much straw. Profound humility in that, and also not like keen to just divulge, like, do you know what I mean? It's not so much like, he's not really saying my work's worthless, because actually like straw was quite useful, especially in medieval times. It's as a starter, as a kind of like a kindling for fire and these kinds of things. But also he's not like, Reginald, wait till you hear what I just experienced in the Mass. Like, I can't wait to tell you about it because you'll think I'm class. No, St Thomas just sits back. He's like, this is all from the Lord, you know, like a profoundly humble man. He knows he's been given talents, but he's not keen to broadcast them.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And if you look at throughout his life, he occasionally had positions of really high prestige, you know, being a master at the University of Paris, but occasionally as well, he just did what the Dominicans asked him to do. He served on committees, he taught in Dominican houses as lector and so on. He did what he was asked to do. He was obedient, and it was always in service of the truth. I think that's really significant. And you're right that there was this Godward focus in his life. He wasn't into celebrity. He wasn't into promoting himself as a great artiste or anything like that. He says it once in the Summa Contra Gentiles at the very start of that. He says, and it's one of the few occasions where he actually gets personal and talks about his personal mission and his understanding of that mission. He says, to use the words of Hilary, so he quotes this guy to be personal, he quotes somebody else, but anyway, it works. I am aware that I owe this to God as the chief duty of my life, that my every word may speak of him. And near the end of his life, I think he was given communion in the Abbey of Fossa Nova, and I think there was this beautiful phrase where he said, you know, all my life I have preached of you, I have taught you, my whole life has been about you. He speaks to the Lord in the Eucharist. And I think that's another sense in which he's angelic. We think, when do we enter into the company of the angels? It's in the Mass. That's when we enter into their praise. And if we think of when Thomas stops being really kind of boring in his writing and becomes really poetic and beautiful, is when he writes about the Eucharist. So there's all these beautiful Eucharistic poetry that our brother Father Paul Murray has written about beautifully. The Adoro Te Devote, the Pange Lingua, all of these songs that we know so well, and they're all directed in praise of our Lord in the Eucharist, which I think is so significant. But yeah, he was a man of praise, a man directed to God. He wasn't into being a celebrity.
Like, really to the last minute as well, because another favourite story I have is that as he's lying on his deathbed in Fossa Nova, the Cistercian monks who lived there thought to themselves, well, look, while we're looking after him, like, maybe we could put him to work as he's dying. Something. So, like, they came to, they're like, they did, they came and they're like, could you dictate, what was it?
Commentary in the
Song of Songs, exactly. And so St. Thomas was like, yeah, okay, like, I'm not going anywhere, at least for the next 2 days. So he just dictated. Now, unfortunately, this work is now lost. But, like, right up until his last, like, his dying breath, he was totally devoted to that Lord, to serving him. And you mentioned, like, the great Eucharistic hymns. These are like pouring with devotion. If you want to see St. Thomas, the devout man, you know, the saint, like, go to his Eucharistic hymns, go to the Pange Lingua, go to Adoro Te Devote. Okay, you might need a translation, of course. I would, but you really see coming through there, like, his great love for that Lord, you know.
I think as well in other writings of his as well, like he is baptizing Aristotle, you know, but he's also making Aristotle humble in a sense, you know, like when he talks about the magnanimous man, which is in Aristotle, like Aristotle has this idea of the magnanimous man, and like he's basically a self-made man who has great gifts and great talents and is kind of snobbish in a sense. But he's somebody to look up to because he does great things and they're worthy of honor, you know.
Yeah.
But when Thomas baptizes that, he takes it and he says, considering of the gifts he has from God.
Yeah.
You know, do you understand? So,
exactly.
Thomas himself is magnanimous. Okay, he is doing something worthy of honor. His Summa, his masterpiece. You know, things they're worthy of honor. But consider the gifts he has from God. So they go back to God all the time. You know. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So in that sense, what is he bringing, I suppose, to the church of today? Because that's grand. He's baptized Aristotle like 750 years ago. Can we benefit from that kind of work today, or does the church need that kind of work?
I think, we do. We one of his great achievements is this unity of human nature. Again, you know, the unity of the body and the soul, which again was kind of revolutionary in the time because the soul was so elevated in medieval theology that the body was actually relegated, like the soul wasn't, or it wasn't worthy to be in touch with a soul, you know, and and then he brings in this thing that it's the soul is the form of the body. Okay, it's the soul which gives the body its human identity, you know. So we say that's a human body because it has a soul, because it's vivified by a soul, you know. So this integration of the flesh and the spirit, which is our tradition, you know, just kind of recovering in a sense that the flesh as well, not exalting the flesh, but actually bringing it into our theology. So that's important today because that's what's happening. Like the whole unity of human nature is being forgotten in today's world. We've gone very spiritualized again, and we're actually forgetting the body in its masculinity, body in its femininity. You know, just one example of that. You know?
Just one example. We're coming up against really some of the same challenges today in the culture that maybe St Thomas was facing in 750. They don't look exactly the same. Like if St Thomas was sitting here today, he might be like quite aghast at at how some things have gone. But at the same time, he knew that the depths of human misery, and he knew that like how far really human nature could fall. He wasn't. He's not one to be scandalized.
No, I don't think so. And I think that's a really vital point, that there's a certain serenity in him just as a character, but also in his approach to the truth. He has a confidence in truth, and for me that's really important in the church in our time, that we can maybe lack a certain confidence, which means that we're afraid of objections to the faith. We're possibly, you know, nervous of asking questions. And what Thomas shows is that, you know, a man of profound faith can also be a man of many questions. And that faith, in many cases, you know, it leads us to actually ask more and more and more questions. And of course, we bring those questions to the right places, and we pay attention above all to Scripture and so on, and to Revelation, and we spend time in prayer. There's kind of a humble questioning rather than sort of an arrogant questioning. But at the same time, I think he really shows that the questioning belongs in the life of the church. And he also shows that we should be slow to dismiss people who disagree with us. So the way that his method works is based on debates that took place in universities at the time, where theologians would be trained by means of these debates that took place, live debates. So you might ask a question, do the sacraments cause grace in the soul? And this is something that Thomas Aquinas actually did oversee. He oversaw this debate in Paris, and then one team of students would come up with objections and say, no, it doesn't cause grace and so on. And they'd really make strong points
and here's why.
Against that, and here's why. And so in the case of that debate, there were 19 objections, 19 reasons why the sacraments don't bring about grace in the life of the soul.
All day.
And then another team has to reply to those objections. And so that's the way Thomas approaches in the Summa Theologia. That's what you'll find. You'll find usually 3 objections. You have to be so careful when you're reading the Summa, because you think that this is what Thomas is saying.
I know.
The objections are the opposite. So they're somebody who's going to disagree with what Thomas is eventually going to say. And I think that's an incredibly disciplined method. You're saying, okay, let's take objectors seriously. Let's try to understand what they're actually saying. Let's read people who disagree with us charitably and serenely, because we're confident in the truth.
That's one thing he is actually quite he's not known enough for it, is that he steelmans his opponent's arguments. So like today we are awash with straw man arguments, you know, we just like parody or caricature or whoever we're talking to, our interlocutor. We just caricature what they're saying. St Thomas was really charitable. and actually built up. He gave a lot of the times he gave a better account of their arguments than they actually could themselves. Absolutely. And then he goes about and responds to it. Like, here's something I'm thinking there as you're like 19 objections and then like 19 replies, and then at the end St Thomas might throw in his bit, or he's kind of adjudicating on these like this debate that's ongoing. I'm thinking that the whole time, like, they didn't have Netflix.
No.
Or, you know,
no.
Is this how they entertained themselves? But at the same time, like, a really fun story of mine, it's not mine, but it belongs to St Thomas, but I enjoyed immensely, is that he was invited to a dinner at King Louis IX's house, palace, if you will, and he sat at the table, and the whole time he's not interested in feasting or like the political chat that's going on. He is there. He's there because he probably has to be, and he's running through these like objections from these characters called the Manichees. And it's obviously just in his mind, because he's not distracted by so many things in his world. He's able to go right into his own mind and have this clarity of thought, to be totally removed from what's going on around him in a king's banqueting hall. And they're all there, like, and the king is at the head of the table. And the next thing, like, St. Thomas just bangs his fist on the table, and they all stop, and everyone looks aghast. His Majesty, what will His Majesty think? And St. Thomas just blurts out, "That'll sort the Manichees." Because he'd just worked through it logically. How many of us are able to do this now with all our distractions? You know, go into our little mind, our mind palace or something, if you will, and just like be able to have the clarity of the thought and the attention to just, you know, progress through arguments and then to come to a conclusion. I know in my mind, I'm jumping all over the place.
Exactly, and it relates to what we said in a previous podcast about the challenge of developing a rich interior life in the world of social media. And with Thomas, you see somebody with a really rich interior life. He had taken in so much of the Word of God, and he had so much of that in his memory, and so many other good materials as well. And he just had to develop this really capacious mind through practice. And we see this again at the heart of the church. You have all these universities. The church is actively developing the intellectual life at her own heart, and I think that's really significant for our own time, that we should be attempting to do the same for ourselves. And
even reading St. Thomas, like your own mind becomes more disciplined. Like you start reading the questions on God or wherever it is, but you actually as you go through it, especially if you go through a tutorial with people, you say, okay, I'm beginning to think about God correctly. I'm beginning to understand the Christian faith. And it brings you so much deeper. You know, I think today at times, maybe with young people, they've read Scott Hahn and they've read Theology of the Body, or they've read Introduction to Theology of the Body, and they've discovered the Christian life, you know, or Catholicism, you know. Yeah. But you know, it's only the beginning.
Yes.
You know, it's only the beginning, and I mean, St. Thomas can bring us, not everyone, but he can bring us so much deeper into the whole architecture of the tradition of Scripture, you know. So
for sure.
Yeah.
St. Thomas Aquinas, we love him.
We do.
The scholar, but also the man, the saint, the mystic. He was so much to so many people. Yeah. His legacy and his work carries on, thank God. We are his devoted followers, and we think he can bring an awful lot to the church of today. Brothers, I want to thank you very much for joining us on this episode of The World is Our Cloister.
A pleasure.
Pleasure. Thank you.
So if you want to find out a little bit more about St. Thomas Aquinas, and you should, you can go on to, as Father Conor mentioned, New Advent. There's also Aquinas.
Aquinas is a really good resource on YouTube, in lots of different languages, but subtitled in English the whole way through.
Terrific. Aquinas 101, produced by our American brothers in Washington, D.C. Fantastic video series, makes St. Thomas very, very simple, very accessible, and very fun. And I just highly encourage you to go and maybe even crack open some of St. Thomas's writings and give it a go. Thank you once again for joining us on this episode of The World is Our Cloister. Don't forget to follow us and interact with us, comment on YouTube and on Spotify. And we'll see you the next time for the next episode of The World is Our Cloister. Thanks be to God, and God love you.